Archaic Records.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records here with you again. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. And today we're going to go back to 1972 to take a look at one of my favorite live albums of all time, as recorded at Madison Square Garden by the king of rock and roll and the world's most famous Memphian, Elvis Presley. Now, I believe I told you on this channel about a month and a half or so ago, as I was discussing the 1977 CBS special, that I am a huge Elvis Presley fan. As far as music goes, he has always been one of my favorite conversation pieces. I never get tired of talking about the king. So if for some reason that annoys you, or if you are not really a very big Elvis fan, there's the door, son. But if you ask me, 1972 is a very big year for Elvis Presley. For one reason, he was able to pull off this very successful string of shows at the infamous Madison Square Garden in New York City. Later that year, on November 1st of 1972, Elvis released his concert film, Elvis on Tour, which to me is still one of my favorite music documentaries of all time. This is a film that I still watch on heavy rotation. It's a movie I've never gotten tired of. Now, of course, by the very end of 1972, Elvis had begun preparations for his global broadcast in January of the next year. But for me, the main reason why 1972 is such an important year in the life and career of Elvis Presley was because this was the last full calendar year that Elvis appeared to be in pretty much peak form when it came to his live performances. Now, if you go back and you watch the film Elvis on Tour, which was recorded in the spring of 1972 before Elvis did the string of shows in New York in June, Elvis's appearance had begun to change ever so slightly, and there were a few off-stage scenes in the movie where Elvis, I think, comes across as being a little bit cloudy. But once he hits the stage, his live performances are dynamic. He's spot on. He's energetic. Now, I've always held the opinion that in 1972, Elvis was still very much engaged. I think he was still interested in what he was doing. And I think he still, at that point in time, clung to a little bit of optimism as to what the future held. I have always believed that, Elvis's professional lethargy didn't really set in until after the Aloha show in January of 1973. To me, that is when Elvis really began his, long descent into what would eventually lead to his untimely demise. But if you go back to June of 1972, eager to dispel some of the rumors that had begun swirling around about Elvis's demise, his lack of relevance, and, he also, to confront those who believed that Elvis had been, relegated to playing shows for a bunch of Barney Fifes around the Midwest and southeastern portions of the United States. Elvis and his entire entourage embarked on the big town. And if you ask me, in June of 1972, they set New York City ablaze. As Elvis walked on the stage for those shows at Madison Square Garden, he still possessed his entire artillery of superpowers and proved beyond the benefit of anybody's doubt that when he wanted to, he could at will still destroy any building in the world and dampen a lot of panties in the process. Now, like I said before, I think in 1972, Elvis was still very much engaged. I think when an opportunity came up that excited Elvis, I think he was able to sort of pull himself together. Like I said, you go back and you watch the Elvis on Tour film, which was recorded in the spring of 1972. Elvis appears to be under the influence during some of that movie, at least in my opinion. But in June of 1972, when Elvis arrived in New York City and he, faced the media at the Marriott Hotel in Manhattan, he appeared to be clean. He appeared to be sober. He appeared to be in tremendous shape. He was coherent. He was sharp. He was funny. He had, he'd gotten himself together physically. And I think that the band's preparations for these shows were meticulous. I don't think that they left anything to chance. And if you ask me, the final product, the final results, speak for themselves. To me, this is not only one of my favorite live albums of all time, but I do believe that this is Elvis's best official live album. I would take this record every day over Aloha from Hawaii. For one, not to say I don't love Aloha from Hawaii. Of course I do. All Elvis fans love Aloha from Hawaii. But to me, the Aloha show, both the record and the home video, to me feel a little bit sterile. To me, they feel like something that was taped for television. It doesn't feel like an organic setting. It doesn't feel like your typical Elvis Presley concert. One of the things I love most about this record is I love the ambiance that is created by the crowd noise. I love Elvis's interaction with the crowd. To me, that's one of the whole reasons to go see live music. To me, that's one of the reasons to listen to a live record. Sometimes instead of, throwing on the studio album, and of course I'm a huge fan of all studio records, but one thing I love about live records is I love the participation of the audience. I love those little imperfections. I love those moments of spontaneity that are unique to each and every show as any artist is on tour. Now, that being said, this record, the performance on this record, at least by the band and, of course, Elvis himself, are just incredible. I mean, the band is almost impeccable. Elvis's performance is completely out of sight. I mean, he is spot on. He doesn't miss a cue. He doesn't miss a word. And his voice is in absolute prime shape. Now, you can say a lot of things about Elvis, post the Aloha show when he was sort of in his descent. But one thing you can never accuse Elvis of is losing his voice. All the way up through the end of 1977, Elvis always maintained his voice. But his voice on this record is absolutely unbelievable. And you also get the feeling, listening to this record, that Elvis was very energized. He was having a good time, and if anybody ever questioned Elvis's relevance, which I think by 1972, you're in the Vietnam era, you're sort of post-Summer of Love, the counterculture is a big thing, there's a lot of political strife in the country. I think a lot of people thought that Elvis was sort of a relic of the past. I've mentioned this on this channel before. I grew up in a house without Elvis fans. I did not grow up listening to Elvis. Neither one of my parents were big into the king of rock and roll, I'll tell you that much. Both my parents were very socially conscious. They liked music that was socially conscious. Both of my parents had sort of a, flower child, value system. And to them, Elvis just didn't speak to them. But it doesn't mean that Elvis wasn't still, relevant to a lot of people that lived around the country. And, I think that this record, this performance, shows that when he was on, and in 1972, I think for the most part he was still on, but when he was on and engaged, he was still one of the greatest forces in the history of rock and roll. Now, this record, of course, features, the usual guns in Elvis's 1970s live band. Lead guitarist James Burton, John Wilkinson on rhythm guitar, Ronnie Tutt on drums, bassist Jerry Schiff, piano by Glenn Hardin. Of course, this record features the Sweet Inspirations, Kathy Westmoreland, J.D. Sumners and the Stamps Quartet, and of course the Joe Gershow Orchestra. This record was released on June 30th, 1972, less than 3 weeks after it was recorded. It was certified gold on August 4th, 1972, platinum on May 20th, 1988, double platinum in March of 1992, and triple platinum in 1999. The string of shows in June of 1972 at Madison Square Garden, they also marked the first time that Elvis had played in New York City since 1956, something that, of course, undoubtedly added to his excitement when it came to performing this string of shows. The first song on this record, after, of course, the intro through the 2001 Space Oddity intro, the first song on this record is That's All Right. That's one thing about this album. Also, I really like, a lot of the set list on this record. I've mentioned in the past one thing that, I sometimes doesn't necessarily sit right with me, and it's just in the translation. It's not the songs, because I love all the songs. But sometimes I lose... Elvis loses me sometimes when he does 70s versions of the 1950s classics. Now, this first song on side one is That's All Right. Of course, a song going back to the 1950s. You can hear it when Elvis takes the stage. Now, obviously, I don't know, how soon before the show Elvis arrived. Now, typically, he would arrive not long before the show started. And, of course, he would usually be out of the building before the band stopped playing. So I don't know exactly at what point in time, Elvis shows up behind, backstage. But when he comes out, and I just assume he just sees the mass of humanity at one of the, most famous buildings in the world. I mean, Madison Square Garden arguably is the mecca of sports and entertainment, at least in this country. And you can hear it when he takes the stage. You can hear the excitement in his voice in this version of, That's All Right. It just gets you. And when Elvis hits the stage, one thing I like about this record, I mentioned, especially over, Aloha from Hawaii, is the crowd interaction. When Elvis hits the stage after the 2001 Space Oddity intro into That's All Right, the crowd just goes ballistic. I love listening to this record at a high volume. I like listening to all records at a relatively high volume, but I love listening to this record on a high volume because when that crowd comes up, I've been listening to this record for a long time, and every time he walks out on stage and that crowd comes up, it literally makes the hair on my neck stand up. Awesome performance of That's All Right. Like I said, you can feel just in the energy of the band and in Elvis and his voice, and both are spot on, but you can feel it in his performance, the excitement as he starts that first song. The second song on side one is a song called Proud Mary. I've always liked Elvis's version of this song, all the different recordings of it. I've heard it. This one in particular is pretty snug. It is very spot on. Like I said, every single song on this record. If I don't happen to mention it as I go through the songs, you just keep in mind that every performance on this record is absolutely just flawless. I can't imagine the amount of preparation and the meticulous attention to details that this band went through to get ready for these shows. Because not that Elvis's band was ever sloppy, they certainly weren't. Elvis was not somebody who tolerated a lot of sloppiness within his band, but these performances are incredible. One of my favorite parts about this particular performance, and really every time I hear Proud Mary, especially when you've got hard-working Ronnie Tutt on the skins, as I love the drum fills on this particular recording. I saw an interview one time, and there with Ronnie Tutt, and they were asking him how he got the gig playing with Elvis Presley, and of course, he told the story that Elvis had auditioned many drummers, trying to find the right fit, and Ronnie Tutt was somebody that kind of came in, relatively deep into the process, and although Elvis had auditioned a lot of drummers that were technically very proficient, Ronnie Tutt himself has said that Elvis auditioned several drummers that were probably technically better than he was. But he talked about how Elvis, when he performed, he loved to stand right in front of the drums. He wanted to feel the music. He liked to have a lot of sort of eye-to-eye interactions with his drummer, and Elvis sometimes would sort of communicate through his eyes and certain gestures, things that he wanted done during a song, and for some reason he and Ronnie Tutt sort of spoke that same language. They had this sort of instant connection, and Ronnie Tutt talked about how even in his audition, he'd never met Elvis before. He was probably relatively starstruck to have met somebody like Elvis, to be honest with you, but it just clicked, and he said even during the audition, Elvis sort of started making these gestures. And he said, I knew exactly what he was trying to communicate with me. And when, I did what I thought he was communicating through his eyes and gestures, after they finished playing, Elvis was just like, yes, you're finally the first person to understand what I'm trying to convey. So I love Ronnie Tutt. He's one of my favorite drummers of all time. I love the performance on this song. For some reason, his performance stands out as much as anybody else's. I love the drum fills in Proud Mary. I always have. The third song on side one is a song that's always, sort of made me, I'd say, equal parts amused and confused when it comes to the lyrics. The song is Never Been to Spain. I like the song enough. It isn't necessarily one of my favorite songs in the Elvis, arsenal, but I like I've always tried to figure out, what does this song mean? Of course it says, I've never been to Spain, but I kind of like the music. And you're like, okay, that's cool. I get it. You kind of like Spanish music. And then after that it says, I've never been to England, but I kind of like the Beatles. And you're like, okay, I get it. You don't have to live in England to like the Beatles, but okay, I get it. And then the verse continues and says, so I headed out to Las Vegas, but I only made it to Needles. And you think, okay, well, you like the Beatles, but you've never been to England, so you go to Las Vegas, but you don't even make it there. What do you, run out of gas? Or did you meet some girl in some small town, and, you kind of, shacked up there for a while? But, to me, the most confusing lyric of the whole song is the one after that, where he says, I've never been to heaven, but I've been to Oklahoma. And I've been to Oklahoma. Actually, my grandfather, who was one of my heroes, he was from Oklahoma. He was very proud of his Okie heritage. Of course, he lived most of his adult life in California, but he always celebrated being an Okie. But I have been to Oklahoma on a couple different occasions, and with all due respect to whoever it is that wrote this song, when I think of heaven on earth, or perhaps the most beautiful, amazing places that at least I've ever been, which, is semi-limited, I gotta be honest with you, man. The first place that comes to mind ain't Tulsa. So I've always been a little bit confused by this song. Like I said, it's not necessarily my favorite in the Elvis catalog. But, around 1972, this was a song that Elvis always performed. This particular recording of it, I think is great. Like I said, lyrically, I've never understood what this song means. So I guess I could just be not very smart, which is proven. We've already talked about that on this channel in the past. The next song after that is, man, now we are getting into the jugs. The song is You Don't Have to Say You Love Me. This is an Elvis song that I never get tired of, especially live performances of it. This one in particular, like I said, this is my favorite live official album in Elvis's catalog. And the song You Don't Have to Say You Love Me is one of my all-time favorites. This song is a song I just never get tired of. Elvis pours his whole guts into this song, every song really on this record. After that is the song You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin', of course made famous by the Righteous Brothers. When Elvis starts this song, the first verse of this song, the crowd just erupts. And I can tell you with a fair amount of certainty that there is not a dry clam in the house when Elvis starts belting out this number, which he absolutely destroys. I mean, I love the Righteous Brothers, with all due respect. And I love their version of this song, but they can't even sniff Elvis's version of this song when it's done well. One thing this song always makes me think of, off topic, is the old TV show I sort of grew up watching called Cheers. And it always makes me think of the character played by Kirstie Alley. Her name was Rebecca Howe. And this song was like her kryptonite. The song, every time she heard this song, her knees would buckle and basically her legs would spread wide open in the air. It always makes me think of that. Man, I loved that show, Cheers, when I was a kid. I still actually kind of like it, although when you watch that show as an adult, you sort of have to kind of turn your brain off a little bit when you watch it. Now, I'm somebody who tends to overanalyze everything. Believe it or not, I tend to overthink things a lot too. And several years ago, I went back and I rewatched the entire series of Cheers. It was a show that I loved when I was a kid, but you go back and you watch it as an adult, and it's still funny to me. I love all the characters. I love the writing. I love the setting. But you go back and you watch that show as an adult who's kind of been through some stuff in your life, and you've seen some kind of like darkness, and you understand human behavior a little bit more. Whew, man, Cheers! If you watch it in the wrong sort of mindset, that show is pretty dark. Especially the character Norm, who, when I was a kid, was one of my favorite characters on any TV show. Now, if I go back and watch Cheers now, my favorite character is always Cliff. I loved Cliff Clavin. I think everybody has a little bit of Cliff Clavin in him. I know I certainly do. But if you go back and you watch the show and you watch Norm, it's really pretty depressing. Norm is like a very depressing character unless you just turn your brain off and you don't overanalyze it. I mean, there's literally an episode where it's Thanksgiving and Norm is at the bar calling his wife and she's like not answering the phone. There's something that's really sad about that. If you're somebody who has, like I have, who has worked in places where people show up on Christmas morning and they wonder why their kids don't call them anymore. Anyway, off topic, but that's what always makes me think of is that character on Cheers, Rebecca Howe. Every time she would hear the song You've Lost That Lovin' Feeling, she would literally turn into a pile of slush. I remember the episode actually when she was dating that British billionaire, Robin Colcord, and he actually had Bill Medley show up on the show and sing it to her. That was awesome. I love the Righteous Brothers. I love that song. Off topic, sorry. The next song after that is another one of my favorite live Elvis songs from the 1970s. I've mentioned this before. I love, all of Elvis's eras. Equally to a point, of course, everybody loves, Rockabilly Elvis. That is one of my favorite eras as well. The 1960s with the movies, Especially the movie soundtracks. Some of the movie soundtracks got a little bit, grungy around the edges, and some of the movies, were pretty scuzzy. But I still like the 1960s, but I really love the 1970s. I think Elvis in the 1970s was his most interesting era. I think I mentioned this on the last time I talked about Elvis, but if not, there's this book. It's one of my favorite books about Elvis. I've probably read literally 50 books about Elvis, but this is probably my favorite one. It's called Elvis: The Final Years by Jerry Hopkins. It basically starts in 1970, and it takes you through, to the end in 1977. It's not necessarily the cheeriest Elvis book you could ever read, but it's honest, and I think it, paints a picture of like what Elvis was going through in his life. But to me, Elvis in the 70s has always been the most interesting era for me in his career. And this is a song, of course, Polka Salad Annie, that he played a lot throughout the 1970s. This is a song I love. This is a song when I first moved to New Orleans, back I think in like 2012, I think it was when I first moved to New Orleans. I had this song stuck in my head for like the first 3 months I lived out there. This song features one of the things that stands out the most on this particular track is Jerry Schiff's bass solo on this song could just pucker your butthole. It is one of the coolest bass performances I've ever heard. Jerry Schiff, obviously, anybody who was going to play with Elvis in the 1970s had to be a world-class musician. But, you always hear about James Burton, you always hear about Ronnie Tutt. I think you even hear a lot about John Wilkinson, but sometimes I think that Jerry Schiff is completely overlooked in terms of, the core members of Elvis's band in the 1970s. He was an incredible bass player, despite the fact that he was Canadian. After that, Elvis goes into kind of a medley of sort of 6 songs in a row from the 1950s. He does Love Me, All Shook Up, Heartbreak Hotel, sort of all in their entirety. And then he does a medley of Teddy Bear, Don't Be Cruel, and Love Me Tender. And like I said before, sometimes when it came to Elvis's 50 songs in the 1970s, a lot of times I don't think they necessarily translated as well. I love, of course, all of Elvis's rockabilly hits. But, sometimes they didn't translate well. One of the other issues I've had with them in the past is that sometimes, especially post-1973 into 4, 5, 6, and 7, Elvis just appeared to couldn't have cared less about most of these songs by that point in time. The guy had been singing them for 20 years, so, you can understand why he's burnt out on them. But on this particular recording, this particular show, he still sounds really engaged in them. He has a good time with them. He really, puts himself into them. And so I think all of these songs that close out side 1, these sort of 6 sort of shortened versions of 50s hits, like I said, it's Love Me, All Shook Up, Heartbreak Hotel, Teddy Bear, Don't Be Cruel, and Love Me Tender. I think they're all great. I think they're all pretty true. As true to the originals as they can be when you, instead of playing them with, Scotty Moore, you're playing them with an entire huge band, including an orchestra. But I think that they are well done. And I think as far as the 50 songs in the 70s, it's one of my favorite performances of those songs. Side 2 of this record starts off with another one of my favorite Elvis songs ever, The Impossible Dream. This is a song that I never get tired of. I've been listening to this record a lot over the last few days, trying to sit down and kind of come up with some ideas about it. And sometimes I'll go a few months without listening to, Elvis records, especially live records. But man, The Impossible Dream, especially pretty much every live version of this song I've ever heard. This is just one of my favorite Elvis songs in his entire arsenal. After introducing the band, after that, I almost said Morrissey, Elvis goes into a rendition of Hound Dog, which the first half of it is one of the coolest Elvis moments, I think, in his entire catalog. One of my favorite single performances ever. The first half of this version of Hound Dog, it is sleazy, it's sexy, it's just like dripping. I mean, this song could get you pregnant. And about halfway through the song, then the band kicks it into the traditional tempo and arrangement. And when they transition from this like slow, sultry, soulful, version of Hound Dog into the traditional arrangement, the crowd explodes. And like I said on the, when Elvis comes out on stage for the first song, every time I hear that roar of the crowd, it makes my hair stand up. Same thing on this song on this version of Hound Dog, when they go from this sort of alternate arrangement into the traditional, and the crowd just erupts. Like I just tingle all over, and I can't help but imagine what it must have been like standing on that stage in New York City in Madison Square Garden, the Mecca, and just having this crowd just erupt all around you. It must have just been absolutely incredible. It's no wonder that Elvis was so excited for this string of shows. After that, Elvis goes into, you talk about jumping from the frying pan into the fire, Suspicious Minds. This is another one of my favorite Elvis songs of all time. And this is one of my favorite performances of this song of all time. Now, I have to admit also that I love a band called the Fine Young Cannibals. Now, I don't love all of their stuff, necessarily. But I would say the Fine Young Cannibals are a band that I like about half of their stuff. The stuff I've heard I like. I really like. The stuff I don't like is sort of pretty, heavily in the clunkage bin as far as I'm concerned. But their version of Suspicious Minds is absolutely incredible too. But man, Suspicious Minds, if you don't love that song, I mean, even if you don't like Elvis, like I don't get it if you don't like Elvis, but if you don't like Elvis, I can accept that. But if you don't like the song Suspicious Minds, especially the live versions of especially one of these, this recording of it, I mean, you might need to go into therapy, chum. After that is another song that is just great, which is For the Good Times, sort of a down-tempo, kind of a sad song, kind of a farewell type of song. Elvis destroys that song. After that is the song American Trilogy. Now, I have read that Elvis was urged to consider removing this song from his set list when he played these shows up in Madison Square Garden in New York. But, it's hard to imagine, for one thing, it's hard to imagine Elvis not playing American Trilogy. This was a song that remained in his set list pretty much throughout the end of 1977. But really, this song was Elvis. Of all the songs that Elvis performed live over the years, I think that this was the song that most sort of represented what he was. It's a Southern boy. Elvis was a Southern boy. He was a man of tremendous faith. He was not ashamed of his faith. He was very proud of his faith, and he loved his country. And, I mean, if this song doesn't reflect who Elvis was as a human being, I don't know what other song in his catalog better describes him, and quite frankly, I think describes a lot of his fan base. Now, I am not a person of faith necessarily. I don't have any issues with people of faith, but Elvis he was very proud of it. He was very unashamed of it. And, even in New York, which was far away from the South, far away from Middle America, far away from where a lot of people thought that most of Elvis's fan base, resided. I think even in New York, Elvis fans are Elvis fans. I think a lot of Elvis fans are people, in New York, you may not necessarily be a Southern boy, but I do think a lot of Elvis fans, even in the North, were people of tremendous faith. I think they were people who had a patriotic bent. So I understand maybe, a promoter or a record producer saying, hey, you might not want to, but at the same time, you can't imagine Elvis not playing this song. And, especially if it was just to appease, some guy in a stuffed shirt. I love this version of this song. This, to me, is always one of the best songs on every Elvis concert I've ever listened to throughout the 1970s. And I have listened to hundreds of Elvis concerts throughout the 1970s. But even on nights later on in his career when he was just shambles, he always, was able to put it together and put a nice bow on this song. He always poured everything into this song. I think this was a song that was very important to him. Like I said, I think the song of all the songs that became staples in his, live show or in his catalog, I think this one really represented a lot of who he was. After that is the song Funny How Time Slips Away. Great performance. Another one of the Elvis songs in his catalog that I would consider to be one of my favorites. And of course, as you get older, as I've begun getting older, everybody does, this is a song that becomes more and more relatable. After that, he plays I Can't Stop Lovin' You, another Elvis song that I don't know that this one is necessarily one of my favorites, but it's a great song. It's a song you would expect him to play live. And of course, he closes out side 2 with his exit song throughout most of the 1970s. Can't Help Falling in Love from Blue Hawaii. And, one of the things that stands out about this performance in this song is I feel like Elvis almost sounds a little bit relieved as he's singing the song. I mean, he was so excited at the beginning of this show, you could feel it. And I think as he's singing this song, and this is just me maybe overly interpreting what's going through his head, but I think that as he's singing this song, he knows that he and his band have just basically hit a grand slam. I mean, these shows, this string of shows in New York were as good as any shows in Elvis's entire career, I would argue. And I think when you've been doing it as long as he had, and you were as much of a perfectionist as he was, and somebody who, demanded a lot from the people around him, I think even he could take a second, even as he was closing out the show, to sort of take it all in and maybe feel a little bit of a, maybe take in just a brief celebration. It sounds like in this song he's actually very proud of the show that they've just done, and maybe a little bit even relieved. Of course, the band then goes into the outro music, and of course it ends with the famous Elvis has left the building. You assume that isn't just fodder. You assume that Elvis was out of the building before the band even stopped playing. I remember, if you go back and watch Elvis on tour, which I highly recommend, especially if you've never seen it. Of course, Elvis throughout this whole movie, I think this film, if I'm remembering properly, this film documents 4 live Elvis shows, and they splice them together to put the documentary together. And as Elvis leaves every show, I mean, he leaves the stage and then he is just at a full gallop to get to the car. And he gets in the car, they slam the door behind him, and the tires squeal, and he's out of there, and literally before the band even stops playing. And my wife and I were just up in New York about a month ago, and I remember seeing Madison Square Garden. And I've never actually been to an event at Madison Square Garden, but we kind of went past where Madison Square Garden is, and it's one of the things I think about is just all of the history that was made in and around that building. And it was one of the first things I thought of was this record, because this is one of my favorite records of all time. I'm a huge Elvis fan, but I pictured him, sprinting at a full gallop to get out of there. And then, they slam him in the car, they squeal out, and then they pull out into like midtown Manhattan traffic, and they basically just sit there. It made me snicker. Anyway, man, if you haven't, go back and check out this record. Elvis as recorded at Madison Square Garden, 1972. Like I said, it's one of my favorite live records of all time. And if I'm going to be completely honest with you, I do anticipate Elvis becoming a pretty frequent contributor to the program here. Hopefully that's okay with you. We got other stuff coming up too. Don't need to get your panties all twisted if you're not a big fan of the King. Anyway, man, thank you so much for checking out this video. This is Archaic Records. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. Be sure to go out and support your local record store. By the way, I want to give a shout out to a record store I just discovered this past week here in the Nashville area. It is out in a suburb called Franklin, but the record shop is called Luna Record Shop. It's in a place called the Franklin Factory, which is actually really cool. My wife was sort of describing it to me. Like I said, we spent last week up in, or not last week, we were up in New York last month, I should say, and somebody was really selling us on the idea of going to this place called the Chelsea Market. So my wife and I got really excited about it. I'd never been there before. So we went and found the Chelsea Market in New York, and to me it was just completely underwhelming. I was actually very disappointed that we wasted any of our precious time in New York going to this place called the Chelsea Market. But the Chelsea Market, it's like right across the street from a Google building, and you go into the Chelsea Market, and to me it basically just feels like this very inauthentic, very pseudo wannabe hipster-fied food court for a bunch of Google workers. So my wife took me to this place called the Franklin Factory, and that was what I had in my mind. It's like, I hope it's not like the Chelsea Market in New York. The place is awesome. Anyway, there's a record store called Luna Record Shop. I want to give some props to that place. Was the Jugs, in my opinion. One more thing I need to point out before I get out of here real quick. I sort of forgot. I am a huge Elvis fan, as I mentioned before, and I have quite an extensive collection of Elvis collectibles. It's something I've been collecting for a very long time now. When I moved to New Orleans the first time, through a set of circumstances that you don't necessarily need to hear about right now, I eventually lost all of my possessions, and I basically had to start over. Believe it or not, all of this clutter around me has been accumulated basically since 2012 or 2013, because my first experience living in New Orleans, I lost everything I owned. My entire music collection, all my VHS tapes, all my DVDs, all my books, all my clothes. You get basically what I'm saying. And so I've gone back and first I was like, I'm not buying anything. I'm going to be a total minimalist because I had a collecting habit. I collected records and CDs and books and toys and everything. All the stuff you see around me. And one of the things I do collect, though, is Elvis memorabilia. So I have to give some props to my wife, who found my latest piece of Elvis memorabilia. One of the reasons why I wanted to talk about an Elvis record today, I wanted to bring it to the table because I wanted to show off this find that my wife found for me at one of our local Goodwills here in the city of Nashville. And one of the fun things about being an Elvis fan. I mean, everything's fun about being an Elvis fan. I was out walking my dog today, and I was listening to this record, on my phone, the Madison Square Garden record, and I was thinking to myself, man, Elvis is just like the best in a lot of ways. You wake up, you feel a little scuzzy, you're not feeling, 100%. Man, just put on an Elvis record. It just makes you feel good. I mean, especially this record, which is so good. But that's one of the fun things about Elvis. But one of the fun things about being Elvis, if you're a collector like I am, is the collectability. I mean, there's just so much just crap to buy of Elvis's, especially down here in Tennessee, especially if you go out to Memphis, which if you haven't been to Memphis, man, you have to go check out Sun Studios. You have to check out Graceland. I mean, Graceland is a place that I never get tired of. It's a place I, Nashville's only about 2.5 hours from Memphis, so it's a place I would go to all the time if I had more free time. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked again. I apologize. But this is my newest piece of Elvis memorabilia. It is an Elvis piggy bank. Of course, Elvis is a pig. You can write your own fat Elvis jokes if you'd like. I prefer not to play that game. I am not somebody who makes fat Elvis jokes now. Unfortunately, my piggy bank is empty. Now, you may be asking me, why is your piggy bank empty? Well, the answer to that question, sir, is very simple. I'm a record collector. I don't have any money. All of my money is in other people's piggy banks. But I want to thank my wife for finding me this very cool Elvis piggy bank. I told her I would put this on the episode. She found this at our local Goodwill for just a couple of bones. So pretty stoked about this, although it does look like he had a little bit of an accident. Not that you can't imagine Elvis sadly having an accident by 1976 or 1977 perhaps. Of course, he blew the seat out of his pants in 1975 famously, so it's conceivable that Elvis could have had an onstage incident back in 1976, 1977. You never know. No judgment. We've all had our moments that were less than stellar. Anyway, I forgot where I was before, so I'll start again. Thank you so much for checking out this video. This is Archaic Records. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. Be sure to go out and support your local record store, Luna Records in Franklin, Tennessee. I love you. Check back every week for Morrissey Monday, a weekly celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths, as well as other record content and album reviews throughout the week. And until next time, my friends, I'll talk to you then.